Nora Betts was a widow who took in wash by the piece. One June morning she knelt in the Brazos shallows and wrung out a dead stranger's collar. That evening, 40 men told the county's grand jury they saw nothing at the ferry crossing. They heard nothing. They were home. Nora said nothing either. She went home, and out of habit, she wrote down the hour. Emmett Cranfill owned the ferry. He owned the store's credit and half the county's mortgage paper. He said it loud, where everyone could hear. There is no witness in Pardee. A laundress keeps no account that concerns any man here. A few men laughed, 40 sworn men, 200 souls, one killing nobody saw. But there was a book, a cheap paper ledger. 11 entries around the 14th of June, and 2 of them did not match what 2 men swore under oath. If you have ever held the one true thing in a room full of agreed-upon lies, this story is for you. Before we go on, do me one small kindness. Subscribe, and stay to the end of this one. And tell me down in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I read them. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a river town in Texas, in the summer of 1884. Pardee sat on a bend of the Brazos, in Harrow County, where the water ran wide and brown and patient. In the wet season, it was the only crossing for 15 miles in either direction. If you wanted to get your cotton to the rail, or your cattle to the buyer, or your sick child to the doctor 2 towns over, you crossed at Pardee. And Emmett Cranfill owned the ferry. Nora Betts kept a cabin above the river, on the high ground, out past the last of the town lots. It was a small place, 1 room, a lean-to, a good stone chimney her husband had built before the river took him. That was the plain fact of it. The Brazos had drowned Silas Betts 11 years back on a spring crossing, when the water came up faster than a man could read it. Nora had watched them lay him out. She had washed his one good shirt herself because she could not bear another woman's hands on it. Then she had gone on living, because there was nothing else to do. She took in wash. That was her trade. She washed for the whole town and made no distinction in it. She washed for Dr. Pyle, who paid on time. She washed for the banker, Mr. Osgood, who paid slow but paid. She washed for the drunk who slept behind the livery when he had a coin, and sometimes when he didn't. She washed for Emmett Cranfill's townhouse, the fine shirts with the store-bought buttons. She loved nobody's standing, and she feared nobody's frown. A shirt was a shirt. A soul was a soul. She scrubbed them all the same, and she kept a book. This is the small thing the whole story turns on, so hold on to it. Nora kept a book of account, a cheap ledger she bought at the store for a dime, the kind with the marbled cover gone soft at the corners. In it she wrote every customer by name. She wrote the pieces, 3 shirts, 2 aprons, a set of sheets. She wrote the date she took the wash, and she wrote the hour she collected it, and the hour she carried it back. And she wrote what was owed, and what was paid. She did it for the plainest reason in the world. Men forget what they paid, she said once, to her neighbor Junie, when Junie asked why she bothered with all that scribbling. And I can't afford to argue a nickel. I put it down, and then there's nothing to argue. The book says what the book says. That was all. A woman protecting her nickels. Nobody noticed. Least of all Nora. She wrote in it with a copying pencil, the indelible kind, the lead that turned purple when it got wet, the kind you licked to darken. Once it was down, it did not come up. She liked that about it. A grocery list you could change your mind on. A debt you could not. She capped that pencil and set it in the crack of the windowsill every night of her life, and she never once thought it was anything but a pencil. Now let me tell you about the 14th of June. Tom Guthrie was a small homesteader with creek bottom acres east of town. Good land. Wet land, the kind that holds through a dry August. Emmett Cranfill wanted it. Cranfill wanted most things, and usually got them, because he held the paper on half the county, and a man who holds your note holds your throat. But Tom Guthrie didn't owe Cranfill a dime. He'd bought his acres clean, years back, and he meant to keep them for his wife Ellen and pass them down. Cranfill named a price. Guthrie said no. Cranfill named a higher one. Guthrie said no again, and he said it in the store, in front of people, which was the wrong place to tell Emmett Cranfill no. On the evening of the 14th, Tom Guthrie went down to the ferry crossing. Nobody agrees on why. And at dawn on the 15th, they found him in the shallows below the landing, face down in the slow brown water, with the current turning him gently against the reeds. I'll not dwell on it. He was dead, and the manner of it was ugly. And that's enough. What matters is what happened after. What matters is the silence, because a killing at the only crossing for 15 miles should have had witnesses. It was a June evening. The light held long. The ferry ran late in summer. Men came and went, hands off Cranfill's ranch, farmers hauling the last of the wool, the ferryman himself working the rope. There should have been a dozen men who saw something. A shout. A shape on the landing. Anything. Instead, there was a wall. The grand jury met in the county seat, and the county sent men out to take statements, and one after another, the men of Pardee said the same thing. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. I was home by dark. 40 men. 40 statements, and you could have laid them one on top of the other and read them all through the stack. They matched so close. The ferryman saw nothing. Cranfill's hands saw nothing. The store debtors, the men who owed on their plows and their seed and their winter flour, they saw nothing, and they said so, and they went back to their lives. And 2 men swore something more particular. Emmett Cranfill swore, in writing, that he had been 15 miles out at his ranch the whole of that evening, and his foreman, Del Faro, swore the same. 15 miles from the crossing, the both of them, from before sundown to full dark. They put their names to it. It went in the county's record, sworn and sealed, and that was meant to be the end of it. You would think the widow, Ellen Guthrie, might have made a noise. And she did. She made the only noise anyone made in the whole sorry business. It was maybe a week after they buried Tom. The store was full, a Saturday, the counted crowd, men leaning on the barrels and women at the dry goods end. Ellen Guthrie came in, and she was not there to shop. She stood in the middle of that floor in her black, thin as a rail, and she asked. She begged, is the truer word. She asked, was there not one man? One man who'd been at the crossing. One man who'd seen her Tom go down. Just one who'd stand up and say what happened. The store went quiet, the way a room goes quiet, when everybody in it is looking at their boots. And Emmett Cranfill answered her. He didn't have to. He could have let the silence do it. But Cranfill was a man who liked to put a thing beyond question, to nail the lid down where everyone could watch him do it. He stood by the counter, big and easy, with his thumbs in his vest, and he said it plain, so the whole store heard. There is no witness in Pardee, Mrs. Guthrie. He let that sit. Then he finished it. A laundress keeps no account that concerns any man here. A few men laughed. Not cruel, exactly, nervous. The laugh of men who are glad the hard thing was said by somebody else. Ellen Guthrie's face came apart, just for a second, and then she gathered it up and walked out with her back straight. And here is the thing you need to see, because it is the whole shape of the woman. Nora Betts was in that store. She was at the dry goods end with a paper of pins in her hand. She heard every word. She heard the laundress line, and she knew. Everyone knew. He meant her. There was one laundress in Pardee. And Nora said nothing. Her face did not change. She paid for her pins. She walked home along the high road with the river on her left, brown and slow. And when she got home, she did the day's book. Not out of defiance. Understand that. She wasn't making a point. There was no point in her yet. She came in, and she took her wash off the line where it had dried, and she counted it, and she got out the ledger and the copying pencil, and she wrote down the shirts that had come back that day and the hour they came back, because that is what she did every single evening of her life. The way another woman might say her prayers. Habit, pure habit. She capped the pencil, she set it in the crack of the sill, she banked the fire and went to bed. She had no idea she had just become the most dangerous person in Harrow County. That would take her all summer to understand. And I want to walk you through it the way she came to it. Slow. Because the slowness is the point. She did not solve it in a night like a clever woman in a story. She was not looking for anything. It crept up on her, one balanced bill at a time. The first inkling came at the end of June. Nora balanced her book by lamplight at the month's turn, the way she always did. She'd go down the entries and tick off who had paid and who owed and carry the debts forward. It was slow, close work, and she liked it. There was a rightness to a column that came out even. She was going down June when 2 entries snagged her. The 14th. Pharaoh, D, 4 shirts, laundered and starched, returned to his hand at his town room. 6:30 in the evening. Paid on delivery, 2 bits. She remembered it, the way you remember small things when the lamp is low and the town is quiet. She'd carried Del Ferro's shirts up the outside stair to the room he kept over the harness shop, and he'd opened the door in his undershirt and taken them and dug the coins out of his pocket and dropped them in her palm. 6:30. She'd written it down at 6:30. And 2 lines further. The same evening, Cranfill Townhouse, collected the week's wash, 7 in the evening. She'd gone round to the back door of Cranfill's fine house in town at 7 and taken the basket from the girl who kept it. Nora sat with the lamp hissing, and something turned over slow in her chest. Because she had heard, the way everyone had heard, what those 2 men swore. 15 miles out at the ranch. The whole evening, from before sundown to full dark. But her book said Del Ferro took his shirts from her hand in town at 6:30, and her book said she collected at Cranfill's townhouse at 7. She sat with it a long moment. Then she did what a sensible woman does. She set it aside. Men come and go, she told herself. Maybe she'd got the day wrong. Maybe Pharaoh sent a man in for the shirts and she'd not marked it. Maybe the great men had ridden in and out and it meant nothing. Who was she to make anything of it? She was a widow with wet hands. She closed the book. She went to bed. But she didn't sleep straight off, and that was new. The second inkling came in July. She couldn't leave it be, is the truth of it, though she told herself she was only being tidy. She went back over June, careful this time, reading not just the 2, but all the entries around them, and what she found made her put the lamp out and sit in the dark a while. It wasn't just 2 men. Around the 14th, in the days right at the crossing, her book put 12 men in town, not scattered home in their beds 15 miles out. In Pardee. She had a wash carried back to the ferryman's own house on the 14th, in the evening, the ferryman who swore he'd seen nothing because he'd gone straight home. She had collections and returns that put Cranfill's hands in town that week, coming and going from rooms and back doors, at hours when they'd all sworn they were nowhere near. 11 entries, once she had them all laid out. 11 ordinary lines about shirts and aprons and the hour they moved. 11 small facts about where the wash went, and the wash went where the men were. And 2 of them, the Pharaoh line, the Cranfill line, didn't just crowd the sworn statements. They ran clean over them. 6:30, 7, in town. Against a written oath of 15 miles and full dark. Still she thought, and I want you to sit with how reasonable she was, because her reasonableness is what makes it true. Still she thought, who on this earth believes a wash book over 40 men? Who takes a widow's dime ledger, with its licked pencil and its soft corners, and holds it up against Emmett Cranfill's sworn word and 40 men behind him? Nobody. She'd be laughed clean out of the county. A laundress keeps no account that concerns any man here. He'd said it in front of the store, and the store had laughed, and they were right to laugh. Because who was she? She put the book on the high shelf, behind the coffee tin, and she tried to let it lie. The third thing happened in August, and it was an accident, and it changed everything. The circuit judge came through twice a year to hold court, and he traveled with a clerk, and that summer the clerk took a room in town while the docket was heard. A dry, particular young man with ink on his fingers and spectacles he was forever cleaning. Nora washed for him, same as anybody. And one afternoon, carrying back his laundered collars, she asked him a question. Careful, sideways, the way you ask a thing you don't want anyone to know you're asking. She asked him, supposing, just supposing, a person had a diary, a private book, where they wrote down their doings. Would a court set any store by such a thing? The clerk cleaned his spectacles and said no. A private diary was near worthless. Anybody could write anything in a diary, after the fact, to suit themselves. A man could sit down the day after and write yesterday, full of lies. No court would hang a cat on a diary. Nora's heart went down like a stone. But the clerk wasn't finished. He was a young man who liked to hear himself be exact, and he went on, not knowing he was handing a widow a loaded gun. Now, a book of account is a different animal entirely, he said. A tradesman's book, a shop book, kept in the ordinary course of the business. And he explained it to her, there in her own wash-shed doorway, cleaning his spectacles, while the collars steamed on her arm. If a person keeps a book in the regular running of their trade, he said, and enters things in it as they happen, day by day, because that's how they get paid, because the book is how the money's reckoned, then that book carries a weight a diary never could. Because it wasn't made to prove anything, it was made to run a business. The entries go in contemporaneous, he said. That was the word, contemporaneous, meaning at the time, in the moment, before anybody dreamed the thing would ever matter to a court. A man doesn't cook his grocery ledger against a killing he can't yet imagine. He just writes down the beans in the flour. And that innocence, that ordinariness, is exactly what makes it strong. A book like that, he said, kept honest, kept regular, entered day by day for the plainest reason in the world, will outweigh any man's memory. Will outweigh a great many men's memories, because memory bends, and men agree with each other after the fact, but an ordinary honest book was set down before the fact, and it cannot be leaned on. He put his spectacles back on. He took his collars. He paid her, and he wrote it down, no doubt, in some book of his own. And he went off up the road with no notion at all of what he'd done. Nora Betts stood in her doorway and went cold in the August heat. Because she understood now. All at once, she understood exactly what was on the high shelf behind the coffee tin. Not a widow's tidy habit. Not a dime ledger. A shop book of account. Kept in the ordinary course of her trade. Entered day by day, hour by hour, because that was how she got her nickels. Because she couldn't afford to argue. Written contemporaneous, that word, that awful useful word, set down on the 14th of June, before Tom Guthrie was cold, before the grand jury met, before Cranfill ever stood in the store, before there was any reason on God's earth for her to lie. 11 entries. 2 that ran clean, over 2 sworn oaths. She held, in her own plain hand, the one thing in Harrow County that could stand up against 40 men. And it could stand up precisely because she was nobody. Because a laundress keeps her account for nickels, not for justice. The very thing Cranfill had sneered at was the thing that made it iron. She went inside, and she sat down, and she did not make a sound. And then, over the first days of September, she understood the second thing. The worst thing. If the book could break the wall, then the wall would break the book. And her with it. She turned it over and over. As long as nobody knew the book existed, she was a widow with wet hands, beneath notice, safe. But the very instant anyone knew what she had, the very instant it got back to Emmett Cranfill that the laundress's account put his foreman in town at 6:30, she would become two things at once. The most dangerous person in the county. And the easiest to silence. A widow alone on the high ground past the last lot, with no man and no standing and no soul who'd raise a fuss if she came to grief on a river that had already taken her husband once. The Brazos takes men, folks said. It could take a woman too, and the town would agree it was a shame, and mean it, and forget her by spring. She saw all of it. Clear as the collars on the line. And here is what she did, and it is the finest quiet thing in the whole story, so don't let it slip past you. She kept writing the book. Exactly as always. She didn't hide it away and stop. She didn't run to the county attorney. She didn't tell a living soul. She understood, and this is the genius of her, the plain, deep sense of a woman who reckoned nickels for 11 years. She understood that the book's whole strength was that it never broke stride, that it was the ordinary course. The moment she started keeping it different, keeping it careful, keeping it for court, it stopped being what made it strong. So she washed. She collected. She carried back, and every evening she got down the ledger and the copying pencil, and she wrote the pieces and the hour and what was owed, the same as she had the night Tom Guthrie died, the same as she had for 11 years. Ordinary. Unbroken. Because the unbroken ordinary course was the whole of its strength, and she meant to keep it whole. She told no one. She waited. She did not yet know for what. But you cannot keep a thing perfectly quiet in a town of 200 souls. It only takes one kind word, said to the wrong ear. It was Junie who did it, and Junie never meant a lick of harm. Junie was Nora's nearest neighbor, a warm, soft, talking woman who loved Nora and worried over her, alone up there on the high ground. And one afternoon Junie was making conversation with the judge's clerk, the very same dry young man, passing the time, praising her friend the way you praise a friend. And it came out, easy as anything, meaning nothing but kindness. Oh, Nora Betts is careful as they come, Junie said. That woman keeps everything wrote down. Every shirt, every hour, every nickel. You could set your watch by her book. She meant it fond. She meant, there's a good steady woman for you. That was all. The clerk, being a clerk, found it a mildly interesting professional fact, and repeated it, no doubt as harmless small talk. Somewhere it could be heard. And in a town of 200, a thing like that climbs. It climbs the way water finds the low ground. It went from Junie to the clerk, and from the clerk to some other ear, and up, until it reached the one man in Harrow County it should never have reached. It reached Emmett Cranfill. That the laundress kept everything wrote down. Every hour. And Emmett Cranfill was not a stupid man, cruel and proud and used to his own way, but not stupid. He knew what his foreman had sworn. He knew what he had sworn. And he could count on his fingers what a book that marked the hour might say about a shirt returned at 6:30 on the 14th of June. He came to see her himself. That was the measure of how it worried him, though he'd have died before he let it show. He didn't send Pharaoh. He came himself, on a fine afternoon in early September, riding up to the high ground where the wash snapped white on the line, and he got down easy and civil, hat in his hand, all neighborly. Nora was at the shed with her arms in the wash to the elbow. She did not stop when she saw him. She did not hurry. She kept working the cloth, and she watched him come, and she felt the thing she'd been dreading arrive at last, on a good horse, smiling. He made his talk. Fine weather, hard for a woman alone. He admired the place, the chimney, the view of the river. And then he came round to it, easy as sliding a card across a table. He understood she kept a book, her accounts, her little ledger. And it occurred to him, he said, that an old book like that was just clutter to a busy woman. All those old sums, no use to anybody once the bills were paid. He'd take it off her hands. For the clutter. And to be neighborly, and because he knew times were hard for a widow, he'd give her a fair price for the trouble. He named it $250. Nora's hands went still in the wash. $250 was more money than she cleared in a year of wet hands and cold mornings. It was a new roof. It was flour through 3 winters. It was never worrying, for a good long while, about a landlord she didn't have or a note she didn't owe. He watched her hear the number. He watched it land. And he smiled the smile of a man who has never once, in his whole life, been told no by anyone who couldn't afford to be told no back. Nora looked at him. Then she looked down. She dried her hands slow on her apron. She went into the shed, and she came back out with the ledger, the soft corner dime ledger, the copying pencil laid in the crease of it, and Cranfill's smile widened because he thought, for one sweet second, that he'd bought it. But she didn't hand it over. She stood there in front of him, with the book closed against her chest, and she took up the copying pencil, and, while he watched, she capped it. Slow, deliberate, she pressed the cap down till it clicked. Like a woman closing a door. "The book's not for sale, Mr. Cranfill," he waited, still half smiling, sure he'd misheard, sure she was only working up to a higher number, the way a person does. "I don't keep it for you to read," Nora said. "I keep it because I get paid from it. And it says what it said before any of you had a reason to lie." For a moment, Cranfill didn't move. The smile stayed on his face, but it had come loose from whatever was behind it. He looked at the closed book against her chest. He looked at the capped pencil in her hand. And something in his eyes went from a man doing a woman a favor to a man doing sums of his own. "That's a lot of money to turn down," he said. "It is," Nora said. He nodded. Slow. He put his hat back on. He looked around the yard, at the lines of wash, at the kettle, at the shed with its one sagging door, like he was pricing it. Then he touched the brim of his hat, the way a gentleman does, and he rode off toward the ferry road, and he did not look back once. Nora stood in the yard till the sound of the horse was gone. Then her knees told her the truth her face had been hiding. She sat down on the chopping block. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from knowing, now for certain, that he knew. She did not sleeve the book in the shed that night. 4 days later, Del Ferro came. He came near dark, which is its own kind of message. He didn't get down off his horse. He sat it in her yard with the light going out of the sky behind him, and he talked to her over the fence like a man talking to a dog he wasn't sure of. "Mr. Cranfill's been thinking on it," Ferro said. "About your book. He wants you to know the offer's gone up. $500 now. $500. Nora dried her hands. She'd learned, by now, to dry her hands when she needed a second to think. She looked up at Ferro, at his shirts, and it struck her, even then, even in the fear of it, that she had washed those very shirts, that she knew the collar size of the man threatening her. "Tell Mr. Cranfill the same thing I told him myself," she said. "It's not for sale." Ferro's jaw worked. "You're a foolish woman." "Maybe," said Nora. "But I'm a foolish woman who gets paid from her book, and I'll thank you to get your horse off my beans." He looked at her a long moment. Then he wheeled the horse around and put it through her bean rows on purpose, snapping the poles, and rode off. She'd made an enemy. She'd known that. What she learned next was how a man like Cranfill made war. Not with fists. He owned too much of the county to need fists. It started quiet. Dr. Pyle, who'd paid her on the dot for 6 years, sent his wash to a woman down in the flats instead. Then Mr. Osgood, the banker, who paid slow, but paid. Then 2 of the store families. Nobody said a hard word to her. Nobody had to. Word had gone out the way word does in a town of 200 souls, a low word passed hand to hand at the counter, that it might be wise to take your washing elsewhere. That Nora Betts had gotten above herself, that she was trouble. Then the store closed her credit. She went in for flour and thread, the way she had for 11 years, and the clerk, a boy she'd known since he was in short pants, went red to his ears and said Mr. Cranfill had said her account was closed. Cash only, and she didn't have the cash, because her customers were drifting off like smoke. She walked home with an empty basket. She passed men she knew. Some looked away. Some looked at her with a kind of pity that was worse than the looking away, because it meant they knew what was being done to her and had decided it was none of their business. That was the hardest stretch. Not the fear, the quiet. The way a whole town could turn its shoulder to you and call it minding its own affairs. And here is the thing she understood. Sitting in her cold cabin with an empty flour tin, she understood it the way you understand a stone in your shoe. The whole town, by now, felt that the book mattered. They didn't know what it said, but they knew Cranfill wanted it, and they knew he'd never squeeze a laundress this hard over old sums, and so they'd worked out, in the animal way a town works things out, that Nora Betts was holding something dangerous. The audience of the town knew the book was a loaded gun. Only Nora knew exactly where it was pointed. And that was the loneliest thing of all, because there was nobody she could hand it to. She thought it through those long nights. County Attorney Halloran was the man the law said should have it. But Halloran owed his office to Cranfill's paper, and everybody knew it, and a book handed to Halloran would go into a drawer and never come out. Or worse, go into a stove. Sheriff Ab Pruitt was Cranfill's man, hat to boots. Hand the book to Pruitt, and she'd have handed it to Cranfill with a badge on. Those were the two hands a woman was supposed to trust, and they were the two hands she could not. So she did the only thing she could do. She kept writing. That was the part nobody would have guessed. In the middle of losing her trade, with a near-empty tin and men riding into her beans, Nora Betts kept her ordinary account book the ordinary way. The few customers she had left, Junie, the preacher, one or two others too poor or too stubborn to be scared off, she wrote them down. The pieces. The date. The hour collected. The hour returned. What was owed. Every night, the copying pencil out of the crack in the windowsill. Every night, capped and laid back. Because she'd understood the clerk's lesson down to the bone. The book was only worth what it was worth, because it was ordinary. Because it had never stopped being what it was. The day she started keeping it different, keeping it careful, keeping it for the trial instead of for the trade. That day it stopped being a shop book and started being a weapon, and a weapon a woman built on purpose was worth nothing against 40 sworn men. Its whole strength was that it had been kept in innocence before anyone dreamed it mattered. So she kept it in innocence still. She kept writing the hour like the world was the same as it ever was. But she wasn't a fool, either. She sat down one evening and, in her own hand, slow, she made a true copy. Every entry from the 1st of June to the end, the 11 around the 14th, the 2 that mattered. She copied them exact, and she wrote at the bottom the date she'd made the copy, and why. Then she took a step that cost her something, because it meant telling. She went to the circuit preacher, a plain old man who owed Cranfill nothing and feared him less, and she told him she kept a book of account, and that it held entries some men would pay a great deal to see burned. She didn't show him the 2. She only made him a witness to the fact that the book was, that it existed, that it said what it said, so that if it vanished, its existence couldn't vanish with it. Then she walked out to the Guthrie place. Ellen Guthrie met her at the door with a baby on her hip in grief, still sitting on her like a second dress. Tom Guthrie had been dead since the 14th of June, pulled out of the ferry shallows at dawn, a man who'd told Emmett Cranfill no about his creek bottom acres and been found drowned for it, and 40 men had swore they saw nothing. Nora told her. Not everything, but enough. That there was a book. That it might, someday, mean her Tom would get a hearing that the grand jury had not given him. Ellen Guthrie stood in her doorway and did not cry. She'd done her crying. She said, "You keep it safe, Nora, and you keep yourself safe. They killed my Tom for a piece of ground. They'll not blink at a laundress." "I know it," Nora said. "Then why?" And Nora thought about it, standing on that hard-swept dirt, and she said the truest thing she had. "Because I wrote it down. And it's true. And I can't unknow that it's true." She walked home in the dark. And that was as far as her planning went. She'd made her copy. She'd made her witnesses. She'd kept her book ordinary. She had done everything a laundress could do. And she waited, because there was nothing left but to wait. The waiting ended in the last week, and it ended hard. She woke one night to the sound of her shed door. Not a knock. A pry. Wood giving up its nails in the dark. She lay still in her bed, with her heart going like a hammer, and she did not get up, and she did not light a lamp, because she was not a fool, and there is nothing a woman alone can do against men in the dark but be quiet and be alive in the morning. They were in the shed a long time. She heard things turned over. The kettle. The baskets. A crate dumped. They were looking. And they were looking for one thing. They didn't find it. Because the book was under her pillow, under her own head, where it had been every night since Cranfill had smiled at her over the wash. In the morning the shed was wrecked, and nothing was gone. Nothing worth stealing had been touched. A thief takes the kettle. These men had left the kettle and gone through her papers. And that told her, and would have told anybody, exactly what they'd come for. She was still standing in the wreck of her shed when Sheriff Ab Pruitt rode into the yard. He came official, star on his chest and a paper in his hand, and a voice pitched for a crowd, though there was no crowd but her. "Ms. Betts," he said, "had some trouble out here, I hear. Break in." He looked at the shed like he was surprised by it. Dangerous, a woman out here alone with valuables, things folks might want. He let that sit. "Now, it's come to my attention you're holding a book. A record of some kind. There's a question of it bearing on the Guthrie matter. I'm going to need to take that into my keeping. For safekeeping. As evidence." And there it was. The trap with the color of law on it, because if she said no to the sheriff, she was obstructing, and if she said yes, the book went into Ab Pruitt's saddlebag and rode straight to Emmett Cranfill's stove, and no court would ever see it, and she'd have handed over the one true thing with her own hand and a lawman's blessing. "I don't believe I have anything that concerns you, Sheriff," Nora said. Pruitt's face hardened. "Don't make this difficult. I'm not making anything," she said. "I'm a laundress. I've got wash to do. I can come back with a warrant," he said. "Then come back with one," said Nora, and her voice was steadier than her hands. And Pruitt, who had expected a scared widow to fold, sat his horse and chewed on it, and finally he said she'd be sorry, and he rode off to fetch his paper. And Nora knew she had, at most, a day. She stood in her ruined yard, and she thought she'd lost. She truly did. A day, and the sheriff back with a warrant, and no clean hand in the whole county to take the book. Then, Junie came up the road at a trot, out of breath, full of news the way Junie was always full of news, and the news this time was the thing that saved everything. "Nora, there's a ranger in town. A real Texas ranger. Come up on other business, some cattle thing, and he's took a room at the boarding house, and he's taking the morning ferry across on his way south." A ranger. Nora. Sat right there at the counter, big as life. A ranger. Passing through. Clean hands from outside the whole rotten web of the county. A qualified man, a sworn man, A man who owed Emmett Cranfill exactly nothing and would be across the river and gone by noon. Nora Betts looked at her wrecked shed and her snapped bean poles, and for the first time in 4 months, she smiled. She knew her moment now, and she knew it had to be done in the one way they'd never expect and never be able to undo. Not in secret, not slipped across in the dark, where later it could be denied, where a ranger's word could be muddied and a laundress called a liar. No, the book had been kept private for 4 months, because privacy was its strength. But the handing over had to be the loudest, most public thing she ever did in her life. Because a thing done in daylight before witnesses can never afterward be undone. She washed her face. She put on her good dress, the dark one she wore to church. She wrapped the book, the soft cornered dime ledger, the copying pencil laid in its crease, in a clean pressed cloth. Like something precious, which it was. And she walked into Pardee in the full light of morning, up the middle of the street, where every soul at the store could see her come. Word ran ahead of her the way it does. By the time she reached the store porch, there was a crowd, the counted crowd, the same men, some of the same 40. She'd sent Junie ahead to fetch her 2 witnesses, and they were there, the old circuit preacher, and Ellen Guthrie with her baby on her hip, standing straight as a fence post. And Sergeant John Reese of the Texas Rangers stood on the boarding house steps with his coffee, watching a woman in a church-going dress walk up the middle of his morning. Nora stopped in the road. Not on the porch, where it could be private, in the road, in the sun, where the whole town could hear. "Sergeant Reese?" "Ma'am, my name is Nora Betts. I take in wash. I've kept a book of my accounts for 11 years, every customer, every piece, the day and the hour I collected it and the hour I gave it back, and what I was owed. I've kept it because men forget what they paid, and I can't afford to argue a nickel." Her voice carried. She'd made sure of it. Some of the hours in this book don't agree with what some men swore to the grand jury about the night Tom Guthrie died at the ferry crossing. I've been offered money for it. I've had my credit closed, and my shed broke into over it. And this morning, the sheriff means to take it for safekeeping, and we all know whose stove it'd be safe in. Nobody laughed now. It was very quiet in the street. Somewhere a horse shifted its feet. "I'm giving it to you," Nora said, "because you're leaving on the ferry, and you don't owe any man here a thing. I'm giving it to you in the open, so that no one can ever say I gave it in the dark. These 2, she nodded to the preacher and to Ellen Guthrie, have known for weeks that it's real and what it holds. So it can't disappear now without half this county knowing it was made to disappear." And she stepped forward, and she put the wrapped book into Sergeant John Reese's 2 hands. He took it. He was a careful man, and he unwrapped the cloth right there in the street and looked at the soft, cheap cover and the copying pencil, and he understood, in the way a man who'd sat through court understood, exactly what he was holding. He looked up at the crowd. He looked at the woman in the dark dress. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll see it to the fall grand jury myself, and I'll swear where it's been every hour between here and there." When Sheriff Pruitt came back with his warrant that afternoon, the book was 15 miles gone, in a ranger's saddlebag, across the river, witnessed by half the town. His warrant wasn't worth the paper. He'd been beaten by a laundress in a Sunday dress, and he knew it, and the town knew it, and there was not one thing his star could do. The fall term came in October. And Harrow County had not seen a crowd like it in years. They came from all over, from the flats, from the creek bottoms, from ranches 15 miles out, because word had spread, and the word was that the laundress's wash book was going before the grand jury, and it was going to be read out loud. Sergeant Reese was there, in from the south, the book in his own hand the whole way. The district judge sat the bench, not a local man, a circuit man, dry and cold and beholden to no one in that county. And the circuit clerk, the same dry young man with ink on his fingers who had once, without knowing it, explained to Nora exactly what she held. sat below the bench with the book open in front of him. The judge laid it out plain for the jurymen, because the law of it was the whole of it. A diary, he said, a thing a person writes for themselves, is worth little. A man can write anything in a diary, and write it after the fact, to serve himself. But a tradesman's book of account, he said, kept in the ordinary course of a trade, entered day by day because the tradesman is paid from it, entered before any dispute arose, and before anyone had reason to shade the truth, that book stands. It stands because it was made in innocence. It stands because to fake 2 dates in it, a person would have had to fake every date around them, would have had to rewrite the whole month's bills for every customer, and every customer would know their own bill was wrong. It could not be done. The book was, the judge said, a photograph of a month, taken before anyone knew there'd be a reason to lie. Then he told the clerk to read. And the clerk read. He read the 11 entries around the 14th of June, plain and dull as a grocer's list. Mrs. So-and-so, 4 shirts and a tablecloth. Collected such a day at such an hour. Junie's wash. Doctor. Piles collars. Osgood's linens. Ordinary, endless, and as he read, the dates and the hours built up around the 14th like water rising against a wall, and every juror there could count, and every juror there could hear that half the men who'd sworn they were scattered and home that evening were in the clerk's flat voice. In town. By the hour, in a laundress's book. A dozen of the 40, placed in Pardee that evening, not by a witness who could be bought or scared, by their own laundry. Then the clerk turned the page, and his voice changed, only a little, the way a man's voice changes when he knows the next thing matters. Entry, the 14th of June, he read. Del Faro. 6 shirts, laundered and starched, returned into his hand at his town room, 6:30 in the evening. Paid on delivery, 2 bits. The room did not breathe. And Del Faro, who had sworn on paper that he was 15 miles out at the ranch all that evening and saw nothing and knew nothing, Del Faro went the color of ash. He came half up out of his seat. His mouth opened. There was nothing in it, because his own shirts had just testified against him. Clean shirts, starched shirts, put into his own hand at 6:30 by the woman he'd rode his horse through her beans to threaten. He'd forgotten. He'd forgotten he paid on delivery. He sat back down slow, like a man whose legs had quit, and he did not look up again. Before the term was out, the grand jury handed up his indictment for perjury, and the paper he'd sworn to was the rope. And then the clerk turned one more page. Entry, the 14th of June, he read. Emmett Cranfill. Household linens and 4 shirts, collected from the townhouse. 7 in the evening. Owed on account. 7 in the evening, the man who owned the ferry and the store and half the mortgages in the county. The man who had stood at that very store counter and said, before the counted crowd, that there was no witness in Pardee, that a laundress kept no account that concerned any man here. That man heard his own name, his own linens, his own hour read out of a laundress's account book. 7 o'clock. In town, on the evening his foreman killed a homesteader at the crossing, and 40 men swore they saw nothing. Cranfill did not go white like Faro. He was a harder thing than Faro. He sat very still, and his face went stiff and careful, and you could see him already reaching for the lie, for the money, for the men, reaching for all the levers that had never once failed him, but the levers weren't there anymore. Because the book had done a thing no threat could do. It had cracked the wall. 2 of the 40, 2 men who'd sworn they saw nothing, 2 men who'd carried it 4 months like a stone in the chest, heard that book read, and understood that the wall was already broken, that the record had done what no man dared do first. And in the jury room, freed by a laundress's shirts, they finally said it, what they'd seen at the crossing on the evening of the 14th. What Cranfill and Faro had done to Tom Guthrie for a piece of creek-bottom ground. 40 men swore they saw nothing, It took 11 entries in a wash book to let 2 of them see again. Emmett Cranfill was indicted before the term closed, not for the book. For the killing the book had finally let men speak of, and it did not stop there. Because a thing like that, once it starts, runs downhill. Sheriff Ab Pruitt's demand, his safekeeping, his warrant, his official visit the very morning after the shed was pried open, stood up in that daylight for exactly what it had been. The judge asked him, cold, from the bench, why a sheriff had gone to seize evidence that a break-in had failed to steal the night before. Pruitt had no answer a man could say out loud. And County Attorney Halloran, who'd sworn there was no case, who'd sat on the whole matter in his little indebted way, Halloran's non-prosecution came apart under that same cold eye. Question by question. Until there was nothing left of it but a frightened man in a good coat. The 2 hands the town said a woman should trust. Both proved rotten, in open court, exactly as Nora had judged them from her cold cabin. She'd refused them both, and she'd been right, and now the whole county saw she'd been right. That was the sweetest part, though Nora never called it sweet. The ordinary book, the dime ledger, the clutter, the thing not worth a busy woman's time, was vindicated before the same counted crowd that had laughed on the store porch when a rich man said a laundress kept no account that concerned any man. They didn't laugh now. They sat in that courthouse, and they were quiet, and some of them, the honest ones, were ashamed because the record had beaten the whole coordinated town. One woman's honest hours had outweighed 40 men's agreed-upon lies. And she'd done it, mind, and this is the thing to hold on to. She'd done it without scheming a single thing. She hadn't set a trap. She hadn't warned an enemy or baited one. She hadn't lied once, or retaliated, or gloated. She'd been squeezed and threatened and robbed, and through all of it she had done exactly one thing. She'd kept writing honestly. That was the whole of her weapon. The truth written down at the hour it happened, by a woman too poor to afford to remember it wrong. The following spring, the Brazos ran high and brown, the way it does when the snow lets go up country, and Nora Betts hung her wash above it in a hard, clean wind. A whole line of shirts, snapping white, bright as flags. She had her customers back. She had more than she'd had before, truth be told, because there is no advertisement in a small county like being the woman who beat Emmett Cranfill with a wash book. The book itself she never got back. It was kept as a court exhibit, filed away with the rest of the Guthrie matter, and when Junie asked wasn't that a shame, wasn't it hers, Nora only shook her head. It's not mine anymore, she said. It never really was. It belonged to whoever needed the truth of that month. That's where it ought to stay. And she took a nickel out of her apron, and she went to town, and she bought a new one, cheap paper, soft marbled cover, a dime ledger, same as the last. She carried it home, and she laid a copying pencil in the crease of it, and that night she wrote down the day's wash, the pieces, the date, the hour collected, the hour returned, and what was owed. Ordinary as bread. Ellen Guthrie kept her creek bottom acres. Her boy grew up on them. As for the others, well, Emmett Cranfill sold the ferry to pay his lawyers, and folks say he crossed it just once after that, on foot, and paid the toll to the new owner like any other man. Del Ferro went west and wasn't heard from. Ab Pruitt was not re-elected. The county found it wanted a different sort of sheriff. And Nora Betts hung her shirts above the river that had taken her husband 11 years back, and she wrote down the hour they came off the line. Because men forget what they paid, and a widow can't afford to argue a nickel. 40 men swore they saw nothing at the river crossing. One woman had already written down what time the shirts came back. If you've made it all the way to the end of this one, do me a kindness and tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from tonight?